The air in the reception hall of the Grand Elysian Hotel was thick with the scent of lilies and ambition. It was a carefully curated atmosphere, every detail polished to a blinding sheen, much like the bride herself. Tiffany moved through the throng of guests like a galleon under full sail, her white dress a testament to both its designer's skill and her father's considerable wealth. She was a porcelain doll brought to life, flawless and cold to the touch, and this was the coronation she had been planning her entire life, disguised as a wedding. Her husband, Mark, trailed in her wake, a handsome but visibly frayed accessory to her grand design. Across the room, standing near a pillar draped in ivory silk, Richard Sterling watched the proceedings with a stillness that was often mistaken for disinterest. He was a man of medium height and build, dressed in a simple, well-tailored, but unremarkable gray suit. His hair was silver at the temples, his face etched with lines that spoke of long hours spent observing the world rather than participating in it. He looked like a retired accountant or a history professor, a man who blended into the background by design. Beside him, his wife, Eleanor, radiated a gentle warmth that seemed to defy the room's refrigerated perfection. Her dress was a tasteful shade of deep blue, her smile genuine, her eyes fixed on her son with a love so pure it felt like a protest in this hall of calculated affections. Richard felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes, the old instinct to frame the scene, to capture the subtle story unfolding in the space between the forced smiles and the clinking champagne flutes. He saw the tension in his son's shoulders, the way Mark's hand would start to reach for his mother's arm before Tiffany would subtly intercept it with a possessive touch on his lapel. He saw the way Tiffany's mother watched Eleanor, her gaze a clinical assessment that found every minor flaw. This was not a joining of families. It was a corporate takeover, and his wife, the heart of their family, was being marked as a liability to be written off. The moment arrived, as Richard knew it would, with the brisk, efficient call of the wedding photographer, a man whose own smile was as lacquered as the bride's. "All right, let's get the family photos done before we lose the light," he chirped, gesturing towards a beautifully arranged backdrop of cascading flowers and soft lighting. Mark, relieved to have a task, immediately turned to his parents. "Mom, Dad, come on." He extended a hand to Eleanor, a genuine warmth finally breaking through his anxious facade. Eleanor's face lit up. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the official stamping of a new bond, a photograph to place on the mantelpiece. She took a step forward, her hand reaching for her son's, but before her fingers could touch his, another hand, pale and adorned with a diamond the size of a robin's egg, shot out like a viper. Tiffany's. She placed it squarely on Mark's chest, a gesture that was both a stop sign and a claim of ownership. "Just the new family for now," Tiffany said. Her voice was sweet, saccharine, but it had an edge of tempered steel. She didn't look at Eleanor. She didn't have to. The words hung in the air, each one a perfectly polished stone cast directly at her mother-in-law. The photographer froze, his professional smile faltering. A few nearby guests went quiet, their polite chatter dying in their throats. The air, already cool, dropped several degrees. Mark's face clouded with confusion. "Tiff, what are you talking about? This is my mom and dad." He tried to laugh it off, a nervous sputtering sound. "They're the family." Tiffany finally turned her gaze toward Eleanor, and it was the look of a curator examining a piece of art that simply did not fit the exhibition. She scanned the simple blue dress, the modest jewelry, the kind, weathered face. "We discussed this, Mark," she said, her voice losing its sweetness and taking on the clipped tone of a chief executive officer. "We need a clean aesthetic, a cohesive look. This is about establishing our family unit." She gestured vaguely at Eleanor. "It's just a different vibe." Vibe. The word was so small, so utterly inadequate for the chasm of cruelty it represented. It was a dismissal not just of a dress, but of a life, of the woman who had raised the man she now claimed as her own. Eleanor's hand, which had been reaching for her son, dropped to her side. The light in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a profound and quiet hurt that was more devastating than any outburst. She physically shrank, folding into herself as if to minimize the disruption her very presence was causing. Richard felt a cold, clean anger rise within him. It was not a hot, messy rage, but a precise and focused energy that sharpened his senses. He could smell the cloying sweetness of the lilies, hear the faint, apologetic cough of a distant guest, feel the smooth, cool weave of his own suit jacket under his fingertips. He saw the scene not as a father, but as he had seen 1,000 other moments of casual, brutal injustice in his lifetime. The powerful preying on the gentle, the arrogant erasing the humble. He took a single, deliberate step forward. His movement was so quiet, it was almost imperceptible, yet it drew every eye. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesticulate. He simply moved to stand beside his wife, placing a hand on the small of her back, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. He looked directly at Tiffany, his gaze level and devoid of heat. "Eleanor is family," he stated. It was not a request. It was not an argument. It was a declaration of an immutable fact, as simple and profound as gravity. The room went utterly silent. Even the photographer seemed to be holding his breath. For a moment, Tiffany looked genuinely taken aback, as if a piece of the furniture had just spoken to her. Her perfectly painted lips parted, then pressed into a thin, hard line. The porcelain doll cracked, revealing the furious ego beneath. "Excuse me?" she hissed, her voice a low whip-crack of disbelief. "This is my wedding day. I have spent a year planning every single detail to be perfect, and I will not have it ruined by sentimentality." She turned on Mark, her eyes flashing. "Mark, control your father, now." It was an order, a test of his allegiance. The entire wedding, all the guests, the photographer, the parents, the past and the future, all of it narrowed to this single, terrible point. Mark stood frozen between his mother's visible pain and his new wife's implacable fury. He looked from one to the other, his face a mask of anguish. He was a man being torn in two. Richard felt Eleanor tremble slightly under his hand. He gave her back a gentle, reassuring squeeze. He did not look at his son. He knew the impossible position Mark was in. His focus remained solely on Tiffany. He had seen bullies like her all over the world. They operated on the assumption of their own supremacy, their own unquestionable authority. They only had power if you gave it to them. Richard Sterling had not yielded to men with guns and flags. He would not yield to a woman with a wedding planner and a misplaced sense of entitlement. "There will be no photographs of this family that do not include my wife," Richard said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried across the suddenly vast space of the ballroom floor. "You may have your clean aesthetic. You will not, however, erase her." Trinket. That was the word that came to mind. Tiffany was treating his wife, a woman whose life was a testament to strength and compassion, like a cheap, mismatched trinket that spoiled the decor. The sheer, unadulterated hubris of it was breathtaking. It filled the room, sucking the oxygen from the air. Tiffany's face, which had been flushed with anger, was now pale with a rage so pure it was almost incandescent. She saw Richard's calm defiance, not as a defense of his wife, but as a direct assault on her authority. "Get him out," she whispered, her voice shaking with fury. She wasn't speaking to Mark anymore. She was looking past him, towards the hotel security guard who stood by the main entrance, a burly man in an ill-fitting blazer. "I want him and his guest removed. They are trespassing." The accusation was absurd, a legal fiction born of pure spite, but the security guard, a young man just doing his job, saw only the bride, the person in charge, pointing a trembling, diamond-clad finger. He began to walk forward hesitantly, his expression a mixture of confusion and reluctance. Mark finally snapped out of his paralysis. "Tiffany, no, stop it. That's my father." "He is ruining our wedding," she shrieked, the last vestiges of her composure shattering like cheap glass. The sound echoed in the cavernous room. Guests flinched. Her own parents rushed forward, their faces aghast, trying to calm her. "Tiffy, darling, please," her mother murmured, trying to pull her away. But Tiffany shook her off. "No, I want them gone," she insisted. Her entire perfect day was collapsing into a vortex of her own making, and she could only see one cause, the quiet, gray man and the woman in the simple blue dress who had dared to exist outside her curated vision. Richard watched the guard approach. He felt no fear, only a profound sadness for his son and for the woman his son had chosen. He held Eleanor's hand, her fingers cold in his. He looked at her, and in her eyes, he saw not just hurt, but a flicker of the old strength he had first fallen in love with 3 decades ago in a dusty, war-torn field hospital. She straightened her back, lifting her chin. They were in this together. It was Mark who finally acted. His face was pale, his jaw set. He stepped between his parents and the approaching guard. "Stop," he said, his voice low and firm. He looked at the guard. "They are with me. They are my parents. Go back to your post." The guard, relieved to have a counter order from the groom, immediately stopped and retreated. Mark then turned to his wife. The look on his face was one Richard had never seen before. The adoration was gone, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed disillusionment. "We need to talk," he said to Tiffany, his voice barely a whisper. "After this, after everything, this is wrong." He then turned, walked to his mother, and took her hand. "Mom, I am so sorry." He kissed her cheek, a public act of penance and renewed loyalty. He looked at his father, his eyes conveying an apology that words could not touch. The immediate crisis was averted. The photographer, desperate to restore order, loudly suggested they take photos of the bride and groom alone. Tiffany, seething but aware she had pushed things too far, allowed Mark to lead her to the backdrop. The tension remained, a thick, poisonous fog that the polite smiles of the guests could not disperse. Richard led Eleanor to a small, quiet table in the corner of the vast room. They sat in silence for a long moment. "I'm sorry, my love," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm sorry I caused a scene." Richard took her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles. "You did not cause anything," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You were perfect. You are perfect. This is not about you. It's about her." He looked across the room at Tiffany, who was now posing for the camera, her smile back in place. A perfect, brilliant lie. Some people spend their lives creating beauty. Others spend their lives curating an image of it. They are not the same thing. He felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, a resolve he had not felt in years. He had made a promise to this woman, when he had put away his cameras, when he had traded the adrenaline of the front lines for the quiet rhythm of a suburban life. He had promised to build a world for her that was safe, that was kind, that was worthy of her goodness. For years, he had succeeded, but now, the ugliness of the world had found them, not in a war zone, but in a ballroom, wearing a white dress and a cruel smile. And it had targeted the one thing he could not and would not ever allow to be harmed, Eleanor's spirit. The photo session eventually concluded, and the guests began to file into the main dining area for the reception. The mood was strained. The story of the confrontation had spread in hushed whispers, and people cast furtive, sympathetic glances towards Eleanor and Richard, and looks of shocked disapproval towards the head table. Tiffany seemed oblivious, or perhaps she was simply determined to power through, her ego a shield against the judgment of the room. During the cocktail hour, as the string quartet played a passionless rendition of a pop song, Mark slipped away from the head table. He found his father standing by the large windows, looking out at the city lights. Richard didn't turn as his son approached. He just continued to gaze at the sprawling metropolis below. "Dad," Mark began, his voice choked with shame. I don't know what to say. The way I just stood there. I am so ashamed. I failed you. I failed Mom." Richard finally turned, and his expression was not of anger, but of a deep, weary understanding. "You were put in an impossible position, son, but you found your way. That's what matters." "It's not enough," Mark said, shaking his head, "to humiliate her like that, to try and erase her from my own wedding." He trailed off, his fist clenching and unclenching at his side. "I saw her face, Dad. It was like Tiffany was trying to tell her she didn't matter, that her whole life, everything she did to raise me, meant nothing next to the color scheme of a party." Richard nodded slowly. "That is precisely what she was trying to do." He paused, his gaze becoming distant, his mind traveling back through the years. Your mother, he began, his voice taking on a different timbre, a storyteller's cadence, spent her life in places where photographs were not taken for aesthetics. They were taken for evidence, for memory, to prove that people mattered, that they lived and loved and fought and died, even when the world wanted to forget them. He reached into his suit jacket, and his hand rested on the inside pocket. He looked at Mark, a new intensity in his eyes. In the coat room, in the pocket of my overcoat, is a small bag. It contains a small, portable projector and a silver case. I need you to get them for me. Mark stared at him, confused. A projector? Dad, what are you going to do? Your wife is obsessed with images, Richard said, his voice flat and resolute. She wants to curate the perfect story of this day. I think it's time everyone saw the real story, the one that came before this, the one that made this day, and you, possible. A plan was forming, coalescing from a lifetime of experience. It was audacious. It was dramatic. It was a violation of every quiet, unassuming principle he had lived by for the last 25 years, and it was absolutely necessary. The reception speeches are scheduled to happen after the main course, Richard continued, his mind working like the intricate mechanism of one of his old cameras. There's a large white screen behind the head table where they're projecting your initials. I need you to find a way to connect the projector to that screen. Can you do that? Mark's eyes widened as the implication of his father's request began to dawn on him. This was not just a countermove. This was a strategic detonation. It was a declaration of war, fought not with angry words, but with light and shadow. A flicker of fear crossed his face, followed by a wave of grim determination. He had failed his family once tonight. He would not fail them again. Yes, he said, his voice firm. Yes, I can do that. The DJ has a tech booth set up right behind the screen. I can handle it. Good, Richard said. He pulled a small, heavy object from his pocket. It was a sleek, black USB drive, cold to the touch. This is for you. Don't plug it in until I give you the signal. The signal will be when I stand up and adjust my tie. He pressed the drive into his son's hand. It felt less like a piece of technology and more like the pin of a grenade. Mark nodded, his hand closing around the drive. He looked at his father, at this quiet, reserved man who he thought he knew so well. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of someone else entirely, a man of immense, hidden depths, a man with a core of something far harder than steel. Dad, he asked, his voice full of a new kind of awe, what's on this drive? Richard allowed himself a small, sad smile. The family photos, he said, the real ones. As Mark slipped away to carry out his mission, Richard returned to the table where Eleanor sat. She was watching him, her brow furrowed with concern. Richard, what was that about? What are you planning? She asked, her voice low. He took her hand again. I am planning to remind everyone in this room, including our son's wife, what a remarkable woman you are. He looked into her eyes. Do you trust me? She searched his face for a long moment, seeing the iron resolve she had not seen since he'd packed away his light meters and telephoto lenses for the last time. She saw the man who had once stared down a tank to get a single, perfect shot of a child holding a flower. I have always trusted you, she whispered. Richard settled back in his chair, a silent sentinel waiting for the right moment. The world seemed to slow down. The chatter of the guests, the clatter of cutlery, the music from the string quartet, it all faded into a dull, distant hum. His mind, unburdened from its long hibernation, began to work. He was no longer Richard Sterling, retired suburbanite. He was back in the field. This ballroom was his zone of operation. The guests were the witnesses. Tiffany was the target, and the truth was his weapon. He let his mind drift back to the beginning. The flashback was not hazy or dreamlike, but sharp and vivid, a series of high-resolution images stored in the vault of his memory. He was younger, his body leaner, harder, his face not yet softened by the comforts of peace. He was in a bombed-out city, the air thick with the smell of cordite and damp, decaying concrete. The constant, low rumble of distant artillery was the soundtrack to his life. His camera, a heavy, battle-scarred Leica, was a permanent extension of his arm. It was his shield and his scalpel, the tool he used to cut to the heart of the human condition. He had built a career on capturing truth in its most raw and brutal form. His photos were not pretty. They were visceral, honest, and often unbearable. They showed the world what it preferred to ignore. He had won awards, graced the covers of every major news magazine on the planet. His name, in certain circles, was legend. But the legend came at a cost. He documented horror, and pieces of that horror inevitably lodged themselves in his soul. He was becoming a ghost, a man who could only see the world through a viewfinder, a detached observer of suffering. And then he met Eleanor. He had been caught in a mortar strike while documenting a civilian evacuation. Shrapnel had torn through his leg. He remembered the blinding flash, the searing pain, and then darkness. He awoke on a cot in a makeshift field hospital set up in the basement of a ruined church. The air smelled of antiseptic, blood, and fear. And standing over him, her face smudged with dirt and illuminated by a single bare bulb, was Eleanor. She was a nurse with a volunteer medical group, a woman who ran towards the chaos that he only photographed. She had saved his leg, and in the weeks of his recovery, she saved his soul. He watched her work. He saw her hold the hand of a dying soldier, her face a portrait of unshakable compassion. He saw her laugh with a group of orphaned children, creating a small island of joy in an ocean of despair. He saw her argue with a cynical army captain, demanding more medical supplies with a ferocity that belied her gentle demeanor. She was not curating an image of goodness. She was goodness. He took her picture just once without her knowing. She was standing in the doorway of the church, bathed in the dawn light, looking out over the ruins of the city. Her expression was not one of despair, but of weary, resolute hope. It was the most profound, the most honest, the most beautiful photograph he had ever taken. It was the only one that mattered. In that moment, he knew he was done. He could not spend one more day as a detached observer of the world she was so desperately trying to heal. He wanted to be a part of her world, not just a documentarian of its brokenness. When he was well enough to walk, he packed his cameras away into a reinforced steel case. He looked at Eleanor and made her a promise. "I'm finished," he'd said. "I want a quiet life. I want to build something, not just record its destruction. I want a life with you." He promised to protect her, to give her the peace she so selflessly gave to others. He had kept that promise for 30 years. He had become Richard Sterling, quiet suburban dad, and packed the legendary photojournalist away, like the cameras in their case. Until tonight. Tonight, the promise had been broken by another, and the only way to restore it was to bring the legend back for one final assignment. The main course was cleared away. The champagne was poured for the toasts. The DJ announced the start of the speeches. Tiffany's father went first, delivering a rambling, self-congratulatory speech about his own business success, with his daughter's wedding as a footnote. Then came Mark's best man, who told a few sanitized, awkward anecdotes. The room was restless, the earlier tension still simmering beneath the surface. Finally, Tiffany stood up, tapping her glass for attention. She beamed, the perfect bride once more. "I just want to thank you all for coming to celebrate the start of our perfect new life together," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured grace. "Mark and I are so excited to build our future, a future based on shared values, a clear vision, and a commitment to beauty in all things." Her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second toward Eleanor, a tiny, triumphant glint of victory. That was the signal. Richard stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He reached up and adjusted his tie, a simple, almost unconscious gesture. But across the room, in the darkened tech booth behind the screen, Mark saw it. His heart pounded in his chest. He took a deep breath, slid the black USB drive into the laptop, and with a click of the mouse, rerouted the projector's input. The giant, glowing T&M monogram behind Tiffany's head vanished. For a split second, the screen was dark. Tiffany faltered, her words catching in her throat as the light behind her changed. And then the image appeared. It was not a wedding photo. It was black and white, grainy, and achingly real. It filled the 20-foot screen, dominating the opulent ballroom. It was a picture of a war-torn street, rubble and twisted metal framing the shot. In the center of the frame, a young woman in dusty, practical clothes knelt on the ground. It was Eleanor. Her face was streaked with grime, her hair matted, but her eyes, fixed on the bundle in her arms, shone with fierce, protective light. She was cradling a small, wounded child, shielding the girl's body with her own as chaos reigned around them. The photograph was a masterpiece of composition and raw emotion. It was a gut punch. It was the truth. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The polite chatter ceased. Cutlery clattered onto plates. Every single guest was frozen, their eyes locked on the staggering image that had replaced the saccharine wedding decor. Tiffany slowly turned, her self-satisfied smile melting from her face as she saw what everyone else was seeing. Her mouth fell open. Richard picked up the microphone from his table. The sound system, still live from the speeches, carried his voice to every corner of the room. It was not loud, but it was clear and resonant, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "My wife was not included in the family photos earlier," Richard began, his voice calm and even. "I was told she did not fit the aesthetic. So I thought it might be helpful to share a few photos from our family album to provide some context." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "That," he said, his voice ringing with a pride he had suppressed for decades, "is Eleanor. In the Balkans, 1993. The child in her arms had been separated from her parents during a bombing. Eleanor stayed with her for 2 days, refusing to evacuate until she located the girl's family." He nodded once, a signal to Mark. The image on the screen changed. The new photo was taken inside a cramped, poorly lit tent. Eleanor, younger still, was visible from the waist up, wearing surgical scrubs. Her face was a mask of intense concentration, her hands, steady and sure, working over a patient who was out of frame. The raw, desperate reality of the scene was a stark, brutal contrast to the perfumed perfection of the ballroom. "This was in a refugee camp on the border of Sudan," Richard's voice narrated, cool and factual. "A cholera outbreak. Eleanor worked for 72 hours straight, without sleep, saving dozens of lives while the official aid organizations were still debating jurisdiction." Click. A new image. Eleanor, standing on the back of a flatbed truck, organizing the distribution of food to a long, desperate line of skeletal figures. Her face was thin, exhausted, but she was pointing, directing, a leader born of compassion and necessity. Click. Another image. Eleanor, laughing, her arm around a group of smiling children in a dusty village square somewhere in South America. She had organized the construction of a clean water well. The room was transfixed. The guests were no longer wedding attendees. They were a congregation, bearing witness to a life of profound and selfless heroism. They were looking at a saint who had been living quietly among them. They turned their heads from the screen to Eleanor herself, who was sitting at the table, her face pale, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. But these were not tears of hurt. They were tears of remembrance, of a life she had lived and a husband who had seen it all. Tiffany stood by the head table, a statue carved from ice. The blood had drained from her face, leaving a pasty, white mask of horror and disbelief. Her perfect day, her perfect narrative, had been hijacked and utterly annihilated by a truth so powerful it was like a physical force. She looked at the images of her mother-in-law, this woman she had dismissed as a frumpy, irrelevant accessory, and saw a giant. And in that moment, she saw herself for what she was, small, petty, and utterly insignificant. Richard gave the signal for the final slide. The screen changed one last time. This image was different. It was a photograph, not of Eleanor, but of a photograph. It showed the iconic cover of Time magazine from 2 decades earlier. The cover featured a now famous, haunting image of a lone soldier silhouetted against a fiery sunset. It was a photo that had defined a conflict, a picture that had won every award imaginable. And there, in the bottom right corner, in the small white font, was the photo credit. Photo by Richard Sterling. A new wave of shock rippled through the room. Whispers erupted. Richard Sterling? The Richard Sterling? The legendary, almost mythical photojournalist who had vanished from public life 30 years ago? It was impossible. He was a quiet man in a gray suit. He was right there. My wife's life is not an aesthetic. Richard said, his voice resonating with a final quiet authority. Her life is a work of art. Her character is the beauty. Her courage is the design. These, he gestured to the screen, are the family photos. This is the family she built. A family of service, of sacrifice, and of a love that is stronger than war and time and petty cruelty. He placed the microphone down on the table. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence filled with awe, with shame, and with a profound, undeniable sense of justice. Then a single person began to clap. It was an elderly man in the back, a distant relative. Then another joined in, and another, and within seconds, the entire room, save for the head table, had erupted in a thunderous standing ovation. It was not for Richard. It was for Eleanor. The guests, as if released from a spell, surged forward. They didn't go to the dance floor. They didn't go to the bar. They bypassed Tiffany completely, leaving her isolated in her white dress, a ghost at her own feast. They swarmed the small table in the corner where Eleanor and Richard sat. They crowded around Eleanor, touching her arm, their faces filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. "We never knew," one woman sobbed. "You are an amazing woman," an older man said, his voice thick with emotion. Mark pushed his way through the crowd. He knelt before his mother, ignoring the expensive fabric of his tuxedo pants. He took her hands in his and looked at her, his eyes swimming with tears of pride and regret. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "I am so, so proud of you, and I am so, so sorry. I never knew." Eleanor cupped his face in her hands. "Oh, my dear boy," she whispered. "It was a lifetime ago. I just wanted to be your mother." "You are so much more," he said, before turning to his father. "Dad." The single word was freighted with a universe of new understanding. Richard simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder and nodded. The lesson was complete. Across the room, Tiffany watched the scene, her face a crumbling facade of composure. Her parents were beside her, attempting to speak to her to comfort her, but she didn't seem to hear them. She was watching her husband kneel before his mother. She was watching the roomful of guests adore the woman she had tried to cast out. Her authority, built on a foundation of money and aesthetics, had been dismantled by something far more powerful: authentic, human greatness. She had tried to ban Eleanor from a photograph, and in response, Richard had turned his wife's entire life into a monument that dwarfed Tiffany into non-existence. She slowly sank into her chair, her body shrinking, her magnificent dress suddenly looking like a hollow costume. Richard helped Eleanor to her feet. The adoring crowd parted for them like the sea. He gently guided his wife away from the center of the storm, towards the exit. They did not look back. Their work was done. As they stepped out of the ballroom and into the quiet, marbled hallway of the hotel, Richard wrapped his arm around his wife. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "I haven't thought about those years in a very long time," she said, her voice quiet. "Thank you for reminding me." She looked up at him, her eyes clear. "And thank you for reminding them." They walked away, leaving the wreckage of a shallow party behind them, their hands clasped, a silent testament to a love story that no photograph could ever truly capture, but which Richard had, just this once, managed to perfectly illuminate. The aftermath of what the guests would forever call the reception revelation was swift and decisive. The marriage, built on such a fragile and selfish foundation, did not last the season. For Mark, seeing the chasm between Tiffany's petty cruelty and his mother's profound goodness was an awakening from which he could not recover. He could no longer look at his wife without seeing the sneer she had directed at Eleanor, without hearing the dismissive words about aesthetics and vibe. The love he thought he had for her was revealed to be a shallow infatuation with a beautiful image, and his father's slideshow had proven in the most dramatic fashion possible how little images mattered compared to substance. Their divorce was quiet and uncontested. Tiffany, stripped of the sterling family name she had so coveted, vanished from their lives, her social standing in tatters. The story of her hubris became a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties and brunches for years to come. Mark, humbled and deeply changed by the experience, dedicated himself to rebuilding the bridges he had nearly allowed to burn. He spent long hours with his mother, not just talking, but listening. He learned about the years she had spent in service, the lives she had touched, the quiet heroism she had carried within her all along. He started volunteering at a local free clinic where Eleanor still worked 2 days a week, finding a sense of purpose that his lucrative but soulless corporate job had never provided. He was forging a new relationship with his parents, one based on a mature, profound respect for the people they truly were, not just the parental roles they had occupied. The most unexpected consequence, however, was for Richard. The story, embellished and passed from guest to guest, eventually reached the ears of a prominent gallery owner who had been a longtime admirer of the vanished Richard Sterling's work. He tracked Richard down, pleading with him to consider a retrospective exhibition. At first, Richard refused. He had left that life behind. But it was Eleanor who changed his mind. "You hid that part of yourself for me," she told him one evening. "Perhaps it's time to share it, not for ego, but for the stories it tells, for the people in those photos." And so, Richard Sterling, the ghost of photojournalism, returned. He and Eleanor spent months in their attic, carefully unsealing the steel cases that had lain dormant for 3 decades. Together, they went through thousands of negatives and prints, each one a window into a shared past. The process was cathartic, a rediscovery not just of his work, but of their journey. The exhibition, titled The Observer and the Healer, opened 6 months later to international acclaim. It juxtaposed Richard's stark, powerful images of global conflict and struggle with quiet, intimate portraits of Eleanor and their life together. The centerpiece of the entire show was the secret photo he had taken of her in the doorway of the ruined church, the one that had changed his life. All proceeds from the exhibition and the accompanying book were donated to Doctors Without Borders, the organization Eleanor had served with all those years ago. Richard had found a new mission, a way to make his past work serve the future, with Eleanor, as always, by his side. One evening, during the final week of the exhibition, Richard was standing before a large print of Eleanor in the Sudanese refugee camp when he sensed a presence beside him. He turned to see Tiffany. She was almost unrecognizable. The haughty confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet, hesitant fragility. She was dressed simply, her makeup was minimal, and her eyes were red-rimmed as if she had been crying. She stood for a long moment, just staring at the photograph of the woman she had so casually dismissed. "I look at this," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, "and I feel so small. The world I lived in was so small." She turned to face Richard, her gaze direct and filled with a shame that seemed genuine. "I came here to apologize, not to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve that, but to say that I am sorry. What I did to Eleanor, to your family, it was monstrous. There is no excuse." Richard studied her face, his expression unreadable. He was not the grieving father-in-law anymore, nor the avenging husband. He was the observer, the documentarian. He saw a woman who had been shattered and was now trying to piece herself back together into something new, something better. "I was so obsessed with creating a perfect life," she continued, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought perfection was about control, about having everything look right. I didn't understand that perfection it's in character. It's in what you do when no one is looking. Your wife is the most perfect person I have ever known, and I tried to throw her away like she was trash." Richard remained silent, allowing her confession to hang in the air of the quiet gallery. He felt a flicker of something, not forgiveness, but a sort of clinical empathy. He had documented the fall of regimes and the collapse of ideologies. He was now witnessing the collapse of a single, misguided soul. "What you do with that realization is what matters now," he said finally, his voice neutral, yet carrying the weight of a final judgment. "An apology is a single frame. A life of changed action is a story. What matters is the picture you create from this day forward." He gave her a final, brief nod, a dismissal that was not unkind, but definitive. He then turned his back on her and walked across the gallery to where Eleanor was speaking with a group of students. He took her hand, and she smiled, her face illuminated by the gallery lights, as beautiful to him now as she had been in the dusty dawn of a war-torn city. Together, They walked through the images of their life, two halves of a whole, their quiet love, the most powerful story in the room. Richard had shown the world his photos, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his true masterpiece had always been, and would always be, the life he had built with the woman holding his hand.